You are listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam-oriented, edited editorial for civil services aspirants. The topic for this podcast is Australia-France submarine deal. Source is Business Standard. Australia's unilateral cancellation of its contract to purchase French submarines and sign up for the AUKUS security pact constitutes a slap in the face for French diplomacy, variously described as a stab in the back and a betrayal by French diplomats. Though Paris may be shocked by this turn of events, it was somewhat foreseeable for several historical, cultural, and diplomatic reasons. Under this contract of the century, agreed to between Paris and Canberra in 2016, France was to provide Australia with diesel-electric Barracuda submarines for a total of 34 billion euros over a 25-year period. For France, the aim was to develop a partnership with the largest nation in the South Pacific, one that should have sealed a close and lasting agreement for half a century, thus reinforcing its diplomatic and military network in an area of great strategic interest. While this plan may have been both judicious because it proposed a third diplomatic path for the region freed from the Sino-American stranglehold, and ambitious because it gave France and Europe a renewed presence in the Indo-Pacific region, there were nonetheless near insurmountable weaknesses in the French position that led to the failure of this collaboration. With US or against US, let's be clear, the alliance proposed by France, while laudable, was nonetheless unusual. Rising tensions with China over the past 3 years have brought Australia back into the American fold in a lasting way. It should be remembered the United States has controlled and monitored Oceania since 1945. It has a network of military bases throughout the region, territories of its own, long-standing political associations, and even its own state, Hawaii. Taking advantage of a relative decline in the US presence in the Pacific under the Obama administration, China has considerably hardened its expansionist policy in the area, which in turn has prompted a US reversal over the past 3 years. This is where Australia comes in. The US had an interest in seeing Canberra cancel its contract with France and replace it with one with Washington, thus ensuring American control over a fleet of submarines they are likely to build themselves, despite what Prime Minister Scott Morrison is saying. The United States is thus returning to the doctrine of with us or against us, initiated by then-President George Bush in 2001. As such, it can no longer tolerate a third way in the Pacific. This inflexibility can only lead to an escalation of tensions between Washington and Beijing, with Australia further increasing those tensions by choosing to side with the US. Talking about friends in high places now, the cancellation of the Australian contract with Naval Group, while brutal, was therefore not totally unexpected, given Australia's historical connection with the US, especially since Canberra had expressed its dissatisfaction to Paris on several occasions. In fact, the perception in France of a reversal of Australia's strategy is misled. AUKUS is a coherent move for Australia, in line with 200 years of Australian diplomatic tradition. It does not mean, however, that it is a good move or a safe one. Australian diplomacy is based on the doctrine of great and powerful friends. Until 1942, when the Statute of Westminster was ratified by the Australian Parliament, the country's diplomatic decisions were largely taken by or in collaboration with London. Since 1945, these same decisions have been made slightly more independently, but often in agreement with Washington. Australia followed the US into Korea, Vietnam, Iraq in 1990, then again in 2003, and Afghanistan. These modest contingents have allowed the United States to disguise its actions as being part of international coalitions. So, is it about security or sovereignty? How could Paris think it could overturn this loyalty and reverse contemporary Australia's deeply anchored colonial mentality? France's military and diplomatic project with Australia reflected a misunderstanding of what the Australians see as the main issues in the Indo-Pacific. France wants to maintain peace in the region, while Australia, rightly or wrongly, believes that war may well happen between China and Taiwan, and thus between China and the US, to whom Australia would lend its support. For France, sovereignty is the alpha and omega of all international action, in a Gaullist tradition shared across the entire French political spectrum. Post-colonial Australia has never been truly sovereign in the way the French understand this notion. Nor does it want to be, because what matters to Australians is not so much sovereignty as security. In this respect, France has neither the scope nor the military capabilities of the United States to attach Australia to its Indo-Pacific policy. The dispossession of Aboriginal lands and the geographical situation of Australia as a settler state in Asia have long led to a widespread sense of the country being under siege. Since 1788, white Australia has feared incursions by the French, the Russians, the Japanese, and finally China. But is anyone truly interested in taking over Australia? Are we big noting ourselves and thinking that we matter to others? This complex considerably weakens the possibility of Australia becoming a non-aligned autonomous nation. Australia seeks protection above all, even if it means enraging allies whom it transforms into adversaries while further antagonizing China. Can we say this is an island in search of a protector? History will tell whether Australia has made the right choice in tearing up its deal with France and joining AUKUS. In the meantime, Canberra is clearly isolating itself in the Pacific, having crossed a point of no return by making its own weapons interchangeable with those of the US Army. Australia has only ever moved between one influence and another. Canberra has never gone it alone, knowing it does not carry much weight on the international stage. However, and this is what seems aberrant and incomprehensible in the eyes of Paris, nor does it wish to give itself the means to develop its own autonomous defense systems and diplomacy. Paradoxically, and beyond the nationalist rhetoric, Canberra seems incapable of forming its own independent destiny in the 21st century. On the contrary, Australia still sees itself as an island in search of a protector, and in its eyes, France cannot take this role between China and the United States. It is therefore a lack of self-confidence, a lack of resources, and above all, a lack of investment and development of its own strategic industries that condemned Australia to inevitably backtrack on one of its deal with France. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the IELTS exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com.